Gur mágad gur háta Joe a sucht an cuire agus is mór an ordum bhean seo for mask in you. I don't get off to use my couple of focal in London very often. So I want to pick up a little bit on what Lisa was saying about the why and what Brexit, why it happened, what it means. And I want to look a bit, well first, because Brexit has always been a choice between being pointless, where the UK follows EU rules but loses their vote, or chaotic, and the UK losing access to the single market. And the big recent change is that it looks like for the new government, it favours the chaotic option. But what I want to think is, how did we get to that point? I want to discuss how Brexit has placed some of the features of the UK constitution or its UK politics in an unflattering light, but also why it would be a mistake to think of Brexit as the result of a uniquely British pathology. Then at the end, I want to look a little bit about what Brexit means for Ireland, its future in Europe, and in particular whether to question whether we've thought deeply enough about some of the choices that we're going to have to make. So first, looking at Britain. The British law students that I teach have been told, really for generations, that their constitution had great virtues of flexibility and stability. No revolutionary change needed in the UK. It could go from government by the king to a constitutional monarchy by means of what are called evolving conventions. And these conventions in British constitution are kind of rules of good behaviour. They're not legal rules, they're expectations of what is and what is not cricket, politically. And this flexibility, I think, has real drawbacks. If Ireland was going to leave the EU, we would have to have a constitutional amendment that repealed the relevant article of the Constitution. So it would have to take specific legal form. What's remarkable is that the discussion of what legal form Brexit would take began in the UK only after the referendum. And it was this absence of a written constitution that they had to amend that allowed the Leave campaign to give absolutely no detail on the legal form that Brexit would take during the referendum campaign. After the referendum, we've also then seen that a system that relies on these constitutional conventions has really struggled to operate in a hyper-partisan atmosphere. Because the conventions are a series of rules and expectations about how things ought to be done, they rely on the good faith of political actors. And in a hyper-partisan atmosphere where each side feels that the stakes are so high that the normal rules of good behaviour don't apply, the conventions cease to function. So we've seen probably significant undermining of the convention that the Speaker of the House of Commons, who's identified himself as a Remainer, is neutral. We've seen the convention that a government defeated continuously on its central programme would resign. That's gone. And even the Queen's political neutrality has been threatened, with there have been calls for her to refuse to sign legislation that's passed by the House of Commons if the government doesn't support it, or to kind of get pulled into these debates about the potential suspension of Parliament. And what this really reveals is that Britain's system, based on the sovereignty of Parliament, just isn't suited to referendums where the people's decision is seen as outranking any decision Parliament can make. And it's seen in kind of what has led to is cries of betrayal and if Parliament tries to adopt particular forms of Brexit, or extraordinary proposals like the proposal that the British Prime Minister could actually suspend or prorogue Parliament in order to stop MPs blocking Brexit from taking place. So all told, the British Constitution and its political elite have come out of this process looking terrible. They failed to ensure that the key issues were thrashed out in the referendum, and have subsequently failed to discuss the trade-offs involved in Brexit in a serious or detailed way. And I think Lisa is absolutely right that they fundamentally misunderstood what the European Union means to its member states. Their negotiation strategy showed they just didn't understand that. But are these failures unique to the UK? Well, in some cases, yes. Lack of written constitution is unique and it hasn't helped. Britain has found, I think, its fall from superpower to mid-ranking state hard to follow. But some of the other failures seem to me less unique. For instance, as in Ireland, the party members now have a large role in selecting the leadership, the Labour and the Conservatives, not MPs. And that has had a real impact in making the Tories who beholden to a very small extremist membership. And in the Labour Party, a larger but similarly unrepresentative membership is controlling the political leadership of the party. That's a big change, and it's something that we see across Europe, where meaningful engagement with political parties has declined, but the power of those parties remains intact. The other thing I'm concerned about is some of the Brexit commentary in Ireland that portrays Brexit as the product of uniquely British fixations on their imperial past. One of the liberations for Ireland of EU membership was that we got a wider range of reference points and moved away from constantly comparing ourselves to our former colonial master. To me, a lot of the Brexit commentary that we see in Ireland, which plays quite well in self-lacerating British, left-wing British circles anyway, aggrandizes Britain by portraying its Brexit failures as unique rather than kind of products of broader European and international trends. Yes, Britain has no shortage of imperial nostalgists who say idiotic things. John Redwood says, oh, Brexit will allow Britain to resume its place at the top table of world affairs. Not without a time machine. But that's not unique to Britain. If you look at the United States, Italy, Hungary, Poland, they've all seen moderate centrist leaders swept away and replaced by people selling easy fixes and nationalistic nostalgia. Certainly, Brexit has made the prospect of leaving the EU look very unappealing to everybody else. But referendums, remember, are notoriously susceptible to being hijacked by those with grievances unrelated to the issue on the ballot paper. In 2005, French and Dutch voters rejected the EU constitution for reasons that subsequent research showed had little to do with the EU. And I, for one, am not certain that if back in 2016 there had been a referendum on EU membership in France or in Italy, we might well now be talking about the unique pathologies of post-imperial France or dysfunctional Italy rather than post-imperial Britain. For Ireland, one of the clearest outcomes of the Brexit debacle has been Ireland's Boston-Berlin debate that the ambassador mentioned last night has been decisively resolved. As late as 2013, a lot of figures, David McWilliams and people were urging Ireland to cut loose from the EU and become part of an English-speaking arc in the North Atlantic with the US and the UK. But when push came to shove in 2016, we had no hesitation in choosing our future as an equal member state rather than as an appendage of America or Britain. The choice was so obvious that there was actually no debate about it. But something where there has been too little debate is Irish policy on the EU beyond Brexit. The government has made very big calls that deserve more scrutiny than they've obtained so far. In particular, Ireland has thrown its lot in what's called the Hanseatic League. That's a group of mainly northern European states, like the Netherlands and Finland, that are fiercely opposed to measures such as Emmanuel Macron's proposed Eurozone budget. Now, Ireland is a wealthy, if heavily indebted member state, and we would be a net contributor to any kind of Eurozone budget. So we can understand why we might be opposed. But it's also the case that most economists think that without significantly more integration in the Eurozone, the chances of an eventual collapse of the euro are much higher. As Ireland would be very badly affected by the collapse of the euro, our choice to be in with the hardcore opponents of further Eurozone integration deserves a lot more scrutiny than it's got to now. So to finish up, I would like to make one broader point. If we look at the history of the Irish state, we can see that Ireland experienced many of the key processes that shaped Western European states relatively late. Things like economic prosperity, secularization, immigration, embrace of liberal norms on sex and sexuality, all happened in Ireland a couple of decades after they happened elsewhere in Western Europe. And that's quite lucky for us, because we can see where others went wrong and learn from it. 20 years ago, Western Europe was in thrall to an American political scientist called Francis Fukuyama's famous theory that we had reached what he called the end of history. He argued back in the early 90s that with the fall of the Iron Curtain, liberal democracy and the market economy were the only games in town. All countries were moving towards liberal democracy, and once they got there, that couldn't be reversed. 20 years later, if you look around Europe with Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban and Brexit, you'd be much less confident that liberalism, democracy, openness and integration are inevitable or irreversible. In Ireland, however, I think we are in our end of history phase. The Foreign Affairs always has an Tillion down the global Ireland that stresses Ireland's social liberalism, its openness to migration. And they're an accurate portrayal. Ireland is socially liberal now. It has absorbed a large number of migrants in a peaceful and harmonious way, and it's keen on further international cooperation. But I would caution against thinking that we have reached the end of history. For Ireland, being wealthy and liberal are still quite recent, so the experience of living in a newly wealthy, newly liberal society is quite exhilarating. The history of Europe in the last 20 years has shown us there is no end of history. Humans often need meaning and belonging as well as votes and money, and they're still attracted to symbols of tribal identity and tribal identity. Looking across at the toxicity and chaos of British politics, there can be a temptation to think that we in Ireland have hit on some kind of winning formula, that we are modern and they're going backwards. And I think that kind of self-satisfied thinking risks blinding us to the challenges that are likely to lie ahead of us. Don't get me wrong, I think that the choices Ireland has made to be open and liberal are net positives. But those choices don't represent a kind of historically inevitable outcome. Virtually all of the prosperous countries of Western Europe have significant political constituencies attracted to less open, more nationalistic versions of society. Closed borders are as modern as open borders. Diversity and liberalism are liberating and enriching, but like all choices, they have their downsides and they don't suit some people's tastes. If Ireland is going to stick with those options, we have to be clear that they are choices and they were going to face opposition at some time. No set of policy options is without its downsides. We didn't have all the answers back in 2006 when we were lecturing Europe about how to follow our tax-cutting, benchmarking and deregulatory Celtic Tiger model, and we don't have them all now. Compared to the UK, our political system is looking pretty good right now, but I do think that we should be a little careful about the kind of virtuous Ireland, awful UK dichotomy that characterises some of our public discussion on Brexit. Good morning.